On a Tuesday morning in September of 1987, Delmar Ostrander walked out to his south pasture before the sun had cleared the tree line and found 3 55-gallon steel drums sitting in the wet grass next to his fence line. There was no truck, there was no note, there was just the dew still heavy on the lids and a set of tire tracks cutting back through the gate toward the county road, already fading in the soft ground. Delmar was 58 years old that morning. He had farmed the same 340 acres in Hardin County, Iowa, since 1954, when his father handed him the deed and shook his hand and told him not to embarrass the family name. He had not embarrassed it. He had run a clean operation, kept his fences tight, rotated his corn and beans the way his father had taught him, and paid every bill he owed within 30 days of receiving it. He was the kind of man who noticed things without saying anything about them, who filed information away in some internal ledger that he never opened in front of other people. He noticed that the drums were painted a particular shade of industrial red-orange that had faded unevenly, suggesting they had sat outside somewhere for a long time before they sat in his pasture. He noticed that the lids were sealed with a bung wrench, not just hand-tightened. He noticed that the grass under the drums was already pressed flat in a way that suggested they had not been set down gently. Someone had rolled them off a truck. He stood there for a long moment with his coffee mug in his hand and the steam rising in the cool September air, and he looked at those drums the way a man looks at something he already knows is going to cost him something. Then he walked back to the house and called his neighbor, Vernon Hassel, because Vernon had worked at the Kellerman Foundry over in Ackley for 11 years before a back injury retired him early. And if anyone would know what those drums contained, it was Vernon. Let me tell you about the Kellerman Foundry because you need to understand what it was before you can understand what it meant to Hardin County, and what it meant to Hardin County before you can understand what those drums were doing in Delmar Ostrander's pasture on that September morning. The Kellerman Foundry had been operating on the south edge of Ackley since 1931. It had been founded by a man named August Kellerman, a German immigrant who had come to Iowa by way of Chicago, and who had decided, for reasons that nobody entirely understood, that a small farm town in the middle of the state was the right place to build a metal casting operation. August had been wrong about a lot of things in his life, but he had not been wrong about that. The foundry had survived the Depression by casting replacement parts for farm equipment at a time when farmers couldn't afford new machinery and needed the old stuff kept running. It had survived the war by pivoting to defense contracts. It had survived the farm crisis of the 1980s by expanding into industrial casting for the construction sector. By 1987, the Kellerman Foundry employed 140 people, made a payroll of roughly $4.2 million a year, and was the largest single employer in Hardin County outside of the school district. The Kellerman family, by that point represented by August's grandson, a man named Bradley Kellerman, understood that this gave them a particular kind of standing in the county. Not the kind that was written down anywhere, the kind that didn't need to be. Vernon Hassel arrived at Delmar's farm 40 minutes after the phone call, driving his old Silverado with the cracked windshield that he'd been meaning to replace for 3 years. He walked out to the south pasture with Delmar and stood in front of the drums for a while without saying anything. Then he crouched down and looked at the bottom edge of the nearest one, where the metal met the grass, and he straightened up and looked at Delmar with an expression that Delmar would describe later as the look of a man who has just confirmed something he was hoping he was wrong about. What Vernon told Delmar was this: the drums were Kellerman Foundry drums. He recognized the specific shade of red-orange, which was a proprietary paint the foundry had used since the 1960s on all their chemical storage containers. What was in them was almost certainly quench oil, the oil used to cool metal castings after they came out of the molds, mixed with whatever contamination had accumulated over years of use. Quench oil that had been cycled through a foundry operation long enough picked up heavy metals, particulate matter, and combustion byproducts in concentrations that made it genuinely hazardous to dispose of through normal channels. The legal disposal route, which involved a licensed hazardous waste contractor, cost money. Real money. The kind of money that a foundry making $4.2 million in annual payroll would notice on a balance sheet if they were paying it regularly. The illegal route was to find a piece of ground that belonged to someone who wouldn't ask questions or wouldn't be believed if they did, and put the problem there. Delmar listened to all of this without interrupting. When Vernon finished, Delmar asked one question. He asked whether the oil in those drums could get into his groundwater. Vernon said that if the drums corroded through, which they would eventually, yes. Delmar's well was 200 feet from the south pasture. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. If you found 3 drums of industrial waste on your property one morning, drums that had been left there without your knowledge or consent by the largest employer in your county, a company whose owner sat on the county planning board and had a building named after his grandfather at the local high school, what would you do? Most people in Delmar Ostrander's position would have made a phone call to the foundry, been told it was a misunderstanding, been offered some nominal sum to accept the situation, and gone back inside. Most people in Delmar Ostrander's position would have calculated, correctly, that making a serious issue of this would cost them more than it would cost the Kellermans. Most people in Delmar Ostrander's position would have let it go. Delmar Ostrander was not most people, but he was also not a fool. He drove to the county extension office that same afternoon and asked to speak to the environmental compliance officer, a position that had existed in Iowa counties since the state's Groundwater Protection Act of 1987, which had passed just 6 months earlier, and which almost nobody in Hardin County had yet had occasion to use. The officer was a young woman named Carol Briggs, who had been in the job for 4 months, and who had, to that point, mostly issued permits for manure storage facilities. Delmar laid out what he'd found, what Vernon had told him, and where his well was relative to the drums. Carol Briggs took notes and told him she would need to send samples to the state lab in Ames, and that the process would take several weeks. Delmar thanked her and drove home. He did not call Bradley Kellerman. He did not tell anyone in town what he'd found. He went back out to the south pasture, and he looked at those drums again in the late afternoon light, and then he went inside and ate supper and did not mention it to his wife, Norma, because Norma worried, and there was nothing yet to be worried about that wasn't already happening. The state lab results came back in November. The drums contained a mixture of used quench oil and cutting fluid with elevated concentrations of lead, zinc, and chromium. The concentrations were above the threshold that required formal remediation under Iowa's new groundwater protection statutes. Carol Briggs filed the report with the State Environmental Office in Des Moines and sent a certified letter to Kellerman Foundry, LLC, notifying them that they were the identified source of the contamination and that they were required by law to arrange for professional removal of the drums and testing of the surrounding soil within 90 days. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 90 days, because it matters to the rest of this story. Bradley Kellerman received the certified letter and handed it to his attorney, a man named Scott Whitmore, who operated out of an office in Iowa Falls and who had handled Kellerman Foundry's legal work for the better part of 15 years. Scott Whitmore wrote back to the State Environmental Office with a letter that questioned the chain of custody of the samples, disputed the methodology of the testing, and suggested that the drums might have been placed on Ostrander's property by a third party with no connection to Kellerman Foundry. He requested a 90-day extension to conduct an independent investigation. The extension was granted. The independent investigation produced nothing. A second extension was requested. The state, which had limited enforcement staff and a backlog of cases across 99 counties, granted it with a warning letter. Delmar received a copy of each letter. He read them at the kitchen table in the evenings with his reading glasses on and his coffee going cold beside him, and he filed them in a manila folder that he kept in the drawer of the roll-top desk in the spare bedroom. He did not respond to any of them because none of them were addressed to him. He was not a party to the correspondence. He was the man in whose pasture the drums were sitting. By the spring of 1988, 6 months had passed and the drums were still there. By the fall of 1988, a year had passed. The state sent 2 more warning letters. Scott Whitmore responded to each one. The drums did not move. Delmar watched them from the fence line occasionally, the way a farmer watches a piece of weather coming in from the west, not with panic, but with the steady attention of a man who knows that what he's watching is going to require something from him eventually, and wants to understand it fully before that moment arrives. What Delmar was doing in those months, in addition to farming his 340 acres and keeping his fences tight and paying his bills within 30 days, was reading. He had driven to the Iowa State University Library in Ames on a Saturday in March of 1988 and spent most of the day in the environmental law section. He was not a lawyer. He had no legal training. What he had was a methodical mind, a genuine gift for reading technical documents, and an absolute certainty that the information he needed existed somewhere and that finding it was a matter of patience and time. He checked out 4 books and a stack of photocopied journal articles and brought them home in a paper grocery bag and read them over the following weeks at the kitchen table after Norma went to bed. Let me tell you about what Delmar found in those books because it's the foundation of everything that came after. What Delmar learned was this: under Iowa's 1987 Groundwater Protection Act, the liability for contamination from improperly disposed hazardous waste attached to the generator of the waste, not simply to whoever happened to be in possession of the drums at any given moment. This was a relatively new legal concept in Iowa, borrowed from the federal CERCLA framework, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, that had been passed by Congress in 1980. What it meant, in plain language, was that Bradley Kellerman could not make the problem Delmar's problem by leaving it on Delmar's land. The liability traveled with the waste, not with the land. Kellerman was the generator. Kellerman was responsible, and the longer Kellerman refused to remediate, the larger the potential liability grew, because the statute included a provision for civil penalties that accrued on a per-day basis from the date of the original notice of violation. Delmar did the arithmetic. The original notice had been issued in November of 1987. By the spring of 1988, the per-day penalties, if ever enforced, would have been accumulating for roughly 150 days. The statute set the maximum daily penalty at $1,000 per day per violation. 3 drums was arguably 3 violations. He wrote the number down on a notepad and looked at it for a while. Then he added up what the penalties would be if the drums were still there in 5 years. In 10 years. He wrote those numbers down, too, and looked at them for a longer while. He did not share any of this with anyone except Vernon Hassel, who drove over one evening in April and sat at Delmar's kitchen table and listened to the whole thing and then said quietly that Bradley Kellerman was not going to like this. Delmar said that was probably true. Vernon asked what Delmar intended to do with the information. Delmar said he intended to wait. Vernon looked at him across the table. He asked how long. Delmar said he didn't know yet. He said he was watching to see whether the state was going to enforce the statute or whether the statute was going to turn out to be the kind of law that existed on paper but not in practice. He said there was no point in going to a lawyer until he knew which kind of law it was, because lawyers cost money, and the answer to that question was free if you were willing to wait for it. Vernon Hassel drove home that night thinking that Delmar Ostrander was either the most patient man he had ever known or the most stubborn, and that in Delmar's case the two things might not be distinguishable from each other. The drums sat in the South Pasture through 1988 and 1989. Delmar tested his well water himself every 6 months using a kit he ordered from a laboratory supply company in Chicago, keeping a log of the results in a spiral notebook that he stored with the manila folder in the roll-top desk. The results were within acceptable limits. The drums had not yet corroded through, but they were corroding. He could see it in the way the painted surface was bubbling and lifting at the seams, the way the bottoms were beginning to show the dark bloom of oxidation where the metal sat in the wet grass. In the spring of 1990, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, which had absorbed the environmental compliance functions of the county extension offices the previous year, sent a new enforcement notice to Kellerman Foundry. This one was different from the previous letters. It referenced the accrued penalty provisions of the statute. It included a calculation of the penalties that had accumulated since the original notice of violation in November of 1987. The number was substantial. Scott Whitmore wrote back within a week, but this time his letter had a different tone. It requested a meeting. Delmar heard about the meeting from Carol Briggs, who had moved to the DNR regional office in Waterloo and who had kept the Ostrander file because she considered it unfinished business. She called him on a Thursday evening to tell him that Kellerman's attorney had requested a meeting with the DNR to discuss a consent order, a negotiated agreement to remediate the site in exchange for a reduction in the accrued penalties. She told him that as the affected landowner, he had a right to be notified of the process, though not necessarily a right to participate in it. She also told him, carefully, that if he had retained an attorney, that attorney might have standing to request participation on his behalf. Delmar thanked her and hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a while. Then he drove to Iowa Falls the next morning and retained an attorney named Raymond Gallagher, who had a small general practice and who had handled some farm real estate work for Delmar's cousin over in Franklin County. Raymond Gallagher was not an environmental specialist, but he was thorough. He was honest about what he didn't know, and he charged $85 an hour, which in 1990 was reasonable. Delmar handed him the manila folder with 3 years' worth of correspondence and the spiral notebook with the well water test results and the notepad with the penalty calculations and explained what he wanted. What Delmar wanted was straightforward. He wanted the drums removed and the soil tested and, if necessary, remediated. He wanted his legal costs covered, and he wanted the accrued penalties enforced, not reduced, because he believed that a penalty which was negotiated down to a fraction of its statutory value was not a penalty at all, but a fee, and that a fee for illegal dumping was simply the cost of doing business, and that if the cost of doing business was low enough, the business would continue. Raymond Gallagher read through the folder and the notebook and the notepad and looked up at Delmar and said that this was a more sophisticated analysis of the situation than he had expected. Delmar said he'd had 3 years to think about it. Raymond said that was apparent. Let me tell you about the consent order negotiations, because they stretched over most of 1990 and 1991, and because what happened in them shaped everything that came after. Scott Whitmore's position in the negotiations was that Kellerman Foundry would agree to remove the drums and test the soil, but that the accrued penalties, which by 1990 had been calculating for 3 years across what the DNR was now treating as 3 separate violations, should be reduced by 90% in recognition of the Foundry's cooperation and its importance to the county's economic base. The DNR's regional enforcement staff, who were overworked and underfunded and who had dozens of other cases in their queue, were inclined to accept something in the range of a 70% reduction. Raymond Gallagher, appearing on Delmar's behalf, argued that any reduction in the penalties below 50% would establish a precedent that effectively nullified the deterrent function of the statute. The negotiations were not dramatic. They took place in conference rooms in Waterloo and Des Moines, in letters and phone calls, in the careful language of regulatory compliance. Bradley Kellerman did not attend any of the sessions. Scott Whitmore attended all of them. He was a competent attorney and a composed man, and he did not display any particular emotion about the proceedings. But at a session in October of 1990, when Raymond Gallagher presented Delmar's well water testing log and noted that the drums had now been in the South Pasture for 3 years and that the corrosion was advancing, Scott Whitmore's composure slipped for just a moment. His jaw tightened. His smile, which he had maintained throughout the proceedings with the professional steadiness of a man who was paid to maintain it, got smaller. His voice, when he spoke, had lost some of its certainty. The final consent order, executed in March of 1991, required Kellerman Foundry to remove the 3 drums within 60 days, conduct soil testing of the surrounding area, and pay a civil penalty of $312,000, roughly 35% of the total accrued amount, which was a reduction, but not the 90% reduction Whitmore had sought. It also required the foundry to submit to a compliance audit of its waste disposal practices going forward and to contract with a licensed hazardous waste disposal firm for all future chemical waste. Raymond Gallagher's fees, totaling $14,200, were paid by Kellerman Foundry as a condition of the agreement. The drums were removed from Delmar's South Pasture on a Wednesday morning in May of 1991. A crew of 4 men in Tyvek suits and respirators loaded them onto a flatbed truck with a hydraulic lift while Delmar watched from the fence line with his coffee mug. The soil testing that followed found elevated zinc concentrations in a roughly 15-foot radius around where the drums had sat, but the levels were below the threshold requiring active remediation. The contamination had not reached the water table. Delmar's well was clean. He went inside after the truck left and told Norma what had happened, and she said she was glad it was over. He said he wasn't sure it was over. She asked what he meant. He said he wasn't sure yet. He poured himself another cup of coffee and went to the roll-top desk and put the final consent order in the manila folder and put the folder in the back of the drawer. Let me tell you about the years between 1991 and 2006, because they are not empty years, even though on the surface they look like ordinary farming years in a quiet county. Delmar farmed his 340 acres. He rotated his corn and beans. He kept his fences tight. He paid his bills within 30 days. He watched the Kellerman Foundry from a distance the way he had watched those drums, with the steady attention of a man who has learned something about a situation and is waiting to see whether what he has learned will matter. What he observed over those 15 years was this. The foundry continued to operate. Bradley Kellerman continued to sit on the county planning board. The compliance audit required by the consent order produced a report that found several additional areas of concern in the foundry's waste handling practices, and the DNR issued 2 additional notices of violation between 1993 and 1998, both of which were resolved through consent orders with reduced penalties. The licensed hazardous waste disposal contract that the foundry had been required to establish was in place for 2 years, and then quietly discontinued when the compliance auditor rotated out and no one followed up. Delmar knew about the additional violations because Carol Briggs, now a senior enforcement officer at the DNR's central office in Des Moines, sent him copies of the relevant documents as a courtesy, because she had kept the Ostrander file, and because she considered him a more attentive steward of the record than most of the DNR's own staff. He added the documents to the manila folder, which had by now expanded to a 3-inch accordion file that lived in the bottom drawer of the roll-top desk. Vernon Hassel died in 1999 of a heart attack at the age of 71. Delmar served as a pallbearer at the funeral. He stood at the graveside in the November cold and thought about the morning Vernon had crouched down and looked at the base of that first drum and straightened up with that particular expression on his face, and he thought that Vernon Hassel had been the first person to tell him the truth about what he was dealing with, and that this was not a small thing. Bradley Kellerman retired from the foundry in 2002 and handed the operation to his son, a man named Chad Kellerman, who had a business degree from the University of Iowa, and a particular confidence in his own judgment that was characteristic of men who have inherited something substantial and have not yet had occasion to understand what it cost to build. Chad Kellerman modernized the foundry's production floor, invested in new CNC casting equipment, and expanded the customer base into the automotive supply chain. He also, in the judgment of several people who worked for him, paid considerably less attention to the foundry's environmental compliance obligations than his father had, which was saying something. Delmar retired from active farming in 2003 at the age of 74 and rented his acreage to a neighbor on a cash rent arrangement. He still lived on the farm. He still walked the fence lines in the mornings. He still went out to the south pasture occasionally and looked at the ground where the drums had sat, where the grass had long since grown back, and you couldn't see anything unusual unless you knew what to look for. He knew what to look for. Now, let me tell you about the morning of April 14, 2006, because that morning is the reason this story is still being told. Delmar was in the kitchen at 5:40 in the morning when he smelled smoke. Not the smell of someone burning brush, which was common in April. A different smell. Heavier, chemical. He went to the back door and opened it and looked south toward Ackley, which was 4 miles away, and he could see the orange glow above the tree line before he could see anything else. He went inside and turned on the radio, and within 10 minutes the local station was reporting that the Kellerman Foundry was on fire. The fire had started in the casting floor's oil quench tank at approximately 3 a.m. The quench tank contained roughly 800 gallons of used casting oil that had been accumulating contamination for an indeterminate period. The foundry's maintenance records, which investigators would later examine, were incomplete in ways that suggested they had not been kept with great care. The fire spread from the quench tank to the adjacent chemical storage area, which contained solvents, cutting fluids, and a quantity of waste oil in unlabeled containers that should not, under any regulatory framework, have been stored there. The Ackley Volunteer Fire Department responded within 12 minutes. They were not equipped to fight a chemical fire of that scale. By the time mutual aid arrived from Iowa Falls and Eldora, the casting floor and the chemical storage building were fully involved. The fire burned for 11 hours. 2 foundry employees who had been working the night shift were treated for smoke inhalation and released. The casting floor, the chemical storage building, and the adjacent finishing shop were total losses. The administrative building and the machine shop on the north end of the property survived. The Kellerman Foundry, as an operating entity, did not. Hardin County Fire Marshal Greg Sorensen and an investigator from the Iowa State Fire Marshal's office spent 3 days on the site after the fire was out. What they found in the ruins of the chemical storage building was consistent with a facility that had been accumulating improperly stored hazardous waste for years. Unlabeled drums, containers stored without secondary containment, waste oil in quantities that exceeded permitted storage limits by a factor of several times. The fire investigators' report, issued 6 weeks after the fire, attributed the ignition to a failed heating element in the quench tank, and noted that the severity and spread of the fire had been substantially worsened by the presence of improperly stored flammable materials in the adjacent building. The DNR opened a new investigation. The EPA was notified because the fire had produced a plume of smoke containing heavy metal particulates that had drifted northeast across approximately 12 miles of Hardin County farmland before the wind shifted. Soil sampling was ordered for farms in the affected corridor. Delmar Ostrander's farm was not in the primary drift corridor. The wind had taken the plume northeast, and his property was due south of the foundry. But he received a notification letter from the DNR anyway. As a property owner within 5 miles of the site, he read the letter at the kitchen table and put it in the accordion file, which was now 4 inches thick and had a rubber band around it because the clasp had broken. Let me tell you about the phone call that came 3 weeks after the fire, because it is the moment this story has been building toward since that September morning in 1987. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Delmar was in the garden. Norma called him in and handed him the phone and told him it was a lawyer. The lawyer was not Scott Whitmore, who had retired. The lawyer was a younger man named Jason Prescott from a firm in Des Moines that specialized in environmental liability. He was representing Chad Kellerman personally, not the foundry, which was now in the hands of its insurance carrier and a bankruptcy trustee. He was calling, he said, because his client was facing potential personal liability for the fire and its environmental consequences, and in the course of reviewing the foundry's regulatory history, he had come across the 1991 consent order and the subsequent compliance record, and he had some questions he hoped Delmar might be willing to answer. Delmar said he was willing to listen. Jason Prescott explained that the foundry's insurance carrier was disputing coverage on the grounds that the fire had resulted from a pattern of deliberate regulatory noncompliance, which, if proven, would void the policy's coverage for environmental remediation costs. The EPA and DNR investigations were ongoing. The potential remediation costs for the foundry site itself were estimated at between $2.8 million and $4.1 million. Chad Kellerman's personal assets, including a house in Iowa Falls and a piece of farmland in Franklin County that his grandfather had bought in 1948, were potentially exposed if the corporate veil was pierced on the grounds that the environmental violations had been knowing and willful. Jason Prescott was trying to understand the full scope of the foundry's regulatory history, and Delmar Ostrander appeared to have a more complete record of it than anyone else. There was a silence on the line. Delmar looked out the kitchen window at the south pasture, at the grass growing over the ground where the drums had sat for 3.5 years. He thought about September of 1987 and the tired tracks fading in the wet grass. He thought about Vernon Hassel crouching down and looking at the base of that drum and straightening up with that expression on his face. He thought about the evenings at the Iowa State Library and the kitchen table and the reading glasses and the coffee going cold. He thought about 19 years. He told Jason Prescott that he had a complete file of every document related to the foundry's environmental compliance history that had been provided to him as an affected landowner, going back to November of 1987. He said the file included the original state lab results, all correspondence between the DNR and Kellerman Foundry, the 1991 consent order, the subsequent violation notices, and the documentation of the lapsed hazardous waste disposal contract. He said he would be willing to make the file available to any investigative authority that requested it through proper legal channels. Jason Prescott asked if he would be willing to share it with his office directly, as a courtesy, to help his client understand his exposure. Delmar said he did not think that was the appropriate channel. Jason Prescott said he understood. He said, after a pause, that his client was in a very difficult position. Delmar said he was aware of that. There was another silence, longer this time. Then Jason Prescott said, carefully, that he had been told, by someone who knew the county, that Mr. Ostrander had been patient about the drums for a very long time, and that he admired that kind of patience, and he asked whether there was anything his client could do, at this point, to address whatever concerns Mr. Ostrander still had. Delmar said that his concerns had been addressed in 1991. He said that what he had now were not concerns but records. He said the records belonged to the regulatory process, and he intended to keep them there. He said he hoped Mr. Prescott's client found a satisfactory resolution to his situation, and that he was going to go back to his garden now. He hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he went back out to the garden. Let me tell you about what the record showed, because the records are the heart of this story, and they deserve to be understood clearly. When the DNR's investigators, working in conjunction with the EPA, requested Delmar's file as part of their formal investigation, what they received was a document record spanning 19 years that was more complete and more carefully organized than anything in the DNR's own files, which had gaps from staff turnover and a 1997 office move that had resulted in the loss of several boxes of paper records. Delmar's file had no gaps. Every letter was there. Every response was there. Every extension request and every warning and every consent order. The well water testing log, with entries every 6 months from 1988 through 2005, was there. The notas from the Iowa State Library were there, and Delmar's careful handwriting on yellow legal paper. Carol Briggs, by 2006 the deputy director of the DNR's Enforcement Division, reviewed the file personally. She told a colleague afterward that it was the most complete private record of a regulatory enforcement history she had encountered in 20 years of environmental work, and that the man who had kept it had understood the legal significance of what he was documenting better than most of the enforcement officers who had worked the case over the years. The EPA investigation, drawn in part on Delmar's records and in part on the foundry's own internal documents recovered from the administrative building that survived the fire, concluded that Kellerman Foundry had engaged in a pattern of known environmental violations spanning at least 15 years. The insurance carrier denied coverage. The bankruptcy proceeding that followed liquidated the foundry's remaining assets: the land, the surviving buildings, the machinery in the machine shop, and the proceeds, combined with a negotiated settlement from Chad Kellerman's personal assets, funded a partial remediation of the foundry site. The full remediation was ultimately completed under a state brownfield program over the following 4 years, at a total cost of $3.1 million, of which approximately $900,000 was recovered from the Kellerman estate. Chad Kellerman sold the house in Iowa Falls and the Franklin County farmland. He moved to Des Moines. The foundry building that had employed 140 people and made a payroll of $4.2 million a year sat empty and fenced off for 3 years while the remediation proceeded, and then the land was sold to a developer who built a small industrial park on it, and the name Kellerman, which had been on a building at the local high school, was quietly removed during a renovation in 2009. Let me tell you about the afternoon in August of 2006 when Jason Prescott drove out to Delmar's farm a second time, this time without calling ahead, because this is the part of the story that Delmar's son, Keith, who was there, has told more than once. Prescott arrived in a silver sedan and parked at the end of the driveway and walked up to the house and knocked. Delmar answered the door. Prescott was not in a suit this time. He was in a polo shirt and khakis, and he looked like a man who'd been sleeping poorly. He said he wasn't there on behalf of his client. He said he was there personally because he had read the file, the whole file, and he wanted to understand something. Delmar let him in and poured him a cup of coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table. Keith Ostrander, who was 38 that year and had driven up from Des Moines for the weekend, sat at the end of the table and did not say anything. Prescott asked Delmar why he had kept the file. Not in a legal sense. He understood the legal rationale. He meant why Delmar had kept it the way he had kept it, with the care and the completeness and the 19 years of well-water tests. He said that most people, in Delmar's position, would have gotten the drums removed and the penalty paid, and considered the matter closed. He said he wanted to understand what Delmar had known or believed that most people didn't. Delmar was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he hadn't known anything in particular. He said that what he had understood from the beginning was that the drums were not an accident. They were a decision, and a decision that had been made once would be made again if it was cheap enough to make. He said that the only way to make it expensive was to keep a complete record, because incomplete records were how decisions like that stayed cheap. He said that the foundry had been counting on the fact that regulatory agencies lost files, and staff turned over and time passed and people forgot. He said he had decided not to forget. Prescott looked at his coffee cup. He said that was, in his professional experience, an unusual way to think about the situation. Delmar said it was the only way that made sense to him. He said that the land was still there after everything else was gone, and that what happened to the land was a matter of record, whether anyone kept the record or not, and that someone ought to keep it. Prescott asked him if he had ever been angry about it. Delmar thought about that for a moment. He said he had been angry on the morning he found the drums. He said the anger had lasted about as long as it was useful, and then he had put it somewhere and gotten to work. He said anger didn't keep records. Prescott nodded. He finished his coffee. He stood up and shook Delmar's hand and thanked him and walked back to the silver sedan and drove away. Keith Ostrander watched the car until it was gone down the county road, and then looked at his father and said he hadn't understood, until that conversation, why his father had spent 19 years on this. Delmar said he wasn't sure 19 years was a particularly long time for something that mattered. Keith thought about that on the drive back to Des Moines. He thought about it for a long time after that. Let me tell you about what happened in the years after, because the story doesn't end with the foundry burning. The brownfield remediation of the Kellerman site was completed in 2010. The industrial park that replaced it employed about 30 people at full occupancy, a fraction of what the foundry had employed, and the county's economic base shifted gradually in the years that followed toward agricultural processing and light manufacturing, which was the direction most of rural Iowa was heading anyway. The loss of the foundry was real. Hardin County felt it. But the foundry had been, as the fire investigators' report had noted without quite saying it directly, a facility whose continued operation had depended on a set of practices that were eventually going to produce exactly the outcome they produced. The question had never been whether the foundry would create a serious environmental problem. The question had been when and how bad, and whether there would be a record. There was a